Well, if you imagine such role-playing games, perhaps I would look at it as a theatrical production. But not everyone thinks as critically as I do. That's the professional deformation of a political strategist. Therefore, I will say that, well, most likely the Kremlin team is trying to put on a brave face in a bad game. It is obvious that when you appear against the backdrop of drawings of a flotilla and then try to create the impression that you are not afraid of anything, traveling around your country and visiting exercises where you say something to Japan, supposedly not seeing it as an enemy, but hinting that if Japan suddenly continues to support Ukraine and together with the democratic world impose sanctions against the Russian Federation, then the Kremlin might not continue to treat Japan that way. He spoke a lot about the Kuril Islands, about the fact that if the West suddenly tries to seize the Russian Federation's shadow fleet, then the Russian Federation will definitely act in a mirror-like manner towards the West. Obviously, all this is an attempt to create the impression that Akela is still sharp on the eve of the elections in the Russian Federation. It is very important to create a sense of stability, which is extremely difficult to do in conditions where Ukrainian drones are visiting an ever-increasing number of settlements in the Russian Federation. Trying to demonstrate emphasized calmness, as if everything is under control, is becoming increasingly difficult. Therefore, most likely the Kremlin resorted to such a tour by the dictator in order to change the trend of internal discussion in the Russian Federation, because it is very important for creating a sense of stability. This is important for the elections and subsequently for mobilization, which is being talked about more and more. Whether it will be covert or overt, that is no longer important. But things cannot continue for the Kremlin in the way they are happening right now. He understands that Ukraine has seized the initiative, and without additional personnel that can be thrown as cannon fodder to the front line to pressure Kyiv, it will be difficult to secure stronger cards for negotiations, which will take place either this year, as many politicians and world leaders promised us, or in the years to come. Yulia?
Yes. To what extent, in principle, should one listen to Putin's statements? Is the Russian people interested in the fact that the dictator has once again threatened, well, now to seize European Union vessels anywhere? A very mysterious place where he intends to do this? And he called all of this a mirror response to the seizure of Russian merchant ships. Considering that this is a shadow fleet, these are ships under absolutely different flags, not Russian ones. What connection then does he have, if you look at the whole situation from the outside, to these ships? How convincing was Putin on this cruiser Varyag with such slogans?
Well, the main takeaway from this recent speech by Putin is that the ongoing coordinated fight against the so-called shadow fleet, where various countries are now taking turns intercepting these vessels in different locations and seizing them, is indeed causing significant tangible damage. It is clearly having a real impact because, let's be honest, if it weren't actually hurting their operations, Putin certainly wouldn't be bringing it up or talking about it in such a defensive manner at all. This clearly means that he really does not appreciate this bold and assertive behavior from the Ukrainian partners. It is particularly frustrating for him when Ukraine, working in close coordination with various Western democratic countries, is actively applying these kinds of significant sanctions against him. It is a situation he finds quite difficult to accept. In the Ukrainian case, in the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea, we use drones that effectively deter the Russian Federation's trade missions under various flags, while in other jurisdictions and in international neutral waters, Western partners stop such vessels that are on the sanctions list. Of course, if we paralyze the Russian Federation's ability to conduct oil trade via tankers, it will be a tangible blow to the state budget. Considering that ballistics and actually North Korean personnel, none of this is aid, unlike how European partners purchase weapons for Ukraine as aid. All of this costs the Russian Federation serious amounts of money. It's many millions of dollars. And this effectively means that if there is a significant hole in the Russian Federation's budget, then this specific form of acquiring additional missiles and necessary personnel will simply become impossible to sustain over the long term. And the fact that Russia is forced to resort to such methods indicates that it is already quite difficult for them to fight against Ukraine on their own. The so-called Second Army of the world is resorting to help from North Korea to fight against the Ukrainian armed forces. The question then is, where does that place the combat capability of the Ukrainian armed forces? Studio?
And regarding Putin's statement about Russians having a genetic code of a winner, I will remind you that he said this at a meeting with the governor of the Sakhalin region. I should note that the dictator mentioned the existence of a genetic code in Russian citizens long before the full-scale war against Ukraine. At the same time, in May of this year, closed sociological polls conducted for United Russia showed that more than 60% of Russians are tired of various aspects of the war and are ready for it to end in any way. Does this tactic of exceptionalism still influence Russian society?
Well, propaganda has to do its job trying to capture the minds of the masses. It's obvious that they are resorting to various, shall we say, extrasensory properties, right? They are looking for mythical thinking in so-called micro-targeting. And so for this target audience, they are trying to come up with something that will encourage them to support the Kremlin's line. Previously, there was talk about a unique mission, that these are believers fighting against Satan and so on. There is nothing the Kremlin won't say to find the key to the minds of the masses so that they continue to support the Kremlin's policy. The more absurd the statements are to common sense, the more it means that, in principle, the arguments for the population as to why they should suddenly continue to support the war have been exhausted. This indicates that Ukraine's response to Russian aggression over the last few months has indeed yielded a tangible result. Now, inside Russia, everyone understands perfectly well that there is no special military operation happening somewhere over there in Ukraine, but rather a very concrete war that affects everyone. Everyone feels this at the level of family well-being. It is felt in the fuel shortages at gas stations. It is felt in the exchange rate fluctuations of the Russian ruble, and ultimately in the ability to buy the same volume of goods with the same amount of money. All of this, like a cumulative effect, yes, one thing adding to another creates burdens. Yes, these burdens of war, so that Russians understand that, well, look, if Putin's policy continues, things will get even tougher for all of you. If you want it to stop, well then go ahead and signal to your top leadership that, well, that's it, it's time to stop. In Zelensky's address, which was an open letter to Putin, he actually pointed out that if you are not yet tired enough to stop military operations, Ukraine, for its part, will do everything necessary to ensure that this fatigue reaches a sufficient level. Studio?
Ruslan, do you not expect any, shall we say, surprises in the upcoming State Duma elections, right? Against the backdrop of what happened with the Yabloko party, the Yabloko members started rapidly gaining ratings, up to 9%. That is, they were clearing the 5% threshold, which would have meant that a peaceful party, peaceful, let's call it that, although that's quite relative in the context of Russia, could have made it into the State Duma. So regarding, well, such slight surprises in terms of there being a massive voter turnout failure, although they might just fake the numbers, or perhaps a massive vote against everyone. Are Russians capable of such a thing? If they were capable of raising the rating of the peaceful, in quotes, party, or is it actually not the case?
Well, that's regarding the raising of the rating. I mean, these are the results of opinion polls that indicate current support. What does that mean? It means that there is already a sufficiently large portion of the population that is not afraid to voice support for more liberal political projects that declare their opposition to military aggression. Conditionally speaking, they are against the war continuing any further. It is obvious that in the conditions of the absence of, yes, Navalny and his team and other opposition figures who are currently outside the territory of the Russian Federation. Yabloko has accumulated support, not because people specifically support this party, but because against the background of other parties, yes, of the options that will be on a hypothetical ballot as a survey questionnaire, they see Yabloko as the option that perhaps might avoid the continuation of military actions. It is obvious that this was noticed, of course, by someone else's hands. Another party appealed to the authorities, and the election commission supported it, actually. And the decision was then materialized into the fact that, well, Yabloko was excluded from the elections. This suggests that, in effect, for those who would like an alternative scenario of events, that is a ceasefire, they will not have such a choice. All the party options that will be available will be either the ruling party itself or satellite projects that vote in unison for what Putin proposes. Thus, in effect, for those who are ready to support yes through their expression of will, the stopping of the war, they simply will have no other way of voting than not to go to the polls, because they will most likely not risk showing up and voting against everyone. But they can sabotage it by not showing up. But as we understand, this will in no way affect the legitimacy. They will draw the necessary numbers there and show the authorities triumphant victory. Actually, the only way to change this drift vector of the Russian Federation, which continues to try to continue and support the aggression, is to sway the Kremlin by scaling up the tactics of conducting combat operations that the armed forces of Ukraine are employing. These are long-range successful strikes on logistics infrastructure, actually. Regarding wild berries, these are strikes on oil refineries. These are strikes on ports and export infrastructure. These are strikes on merchant vessels of the Russian Federation. This is the gradual cutting off of logistics, which led to the isolation of Crimea, to the restriction of the ability to supply personnel with fuel, ammunition, and provisions on the line of combat contact. All of this is leading to the point where the Russian Federation would be ready to stop. Unfortunately, through the internal political process, most likely this is impossible. Studio.
Well,